Today, on Pat's car uncomfortable gravel driveway, an almost complete rear suspension refresh on the Jeep. The order of business is control arms, springs, and shocks. Begin by loosening the wheels, then lift the car up, place some jack stands under it, finish taking the wheels off, and place them underneath as well for extra safety. Next, remove the sway bar end links. Depending on how salty your part of the world is, this might require a grinder. Mine are fairly new, so it wasn't a problem. Now, remove the lower control arm. This will also give you room to get your impact on the sway bar brackets if you are looking to change the bushings in there. You can now use an impact to get the sway bar bracket off. Once it's dangling, it's easy to get a ratchet in that spot to tighten the sway bar bracket back up. So I took the opportunity to fit a new lower control arm in and just hand tighten the bolts up. Afterwards, you can repeat the same thing on the other side. I will be doing a modification while I'm down here. I'm actually not going to be reinstalling the rear sway bar at all. I'm leaving it off. The reason for this is that it will allow the rear axle to flex more while off-roading. You might be concerned for on-road safety, but in this particular case, I think it's fine. The rear sway bar is already pretty flimsy, so it doesn't add that much roll stiffness. I'm also upgrading the springs to the heavy-duty cargo springs and fitting mototube shocks, which are stiffer. I figured that any roll stiffness I lost by removing the sway bar I will regain with the stiffer springs and shocks. Plus, you're not supposed to be driving an off-road SUV like a stolen Honda Civic. Now we move up to the upper control arm. Pretty straightforward this one, just need to open the cover on the side and unscrew the brake line supports. I couldn't get the impact in on the rear bolt, but luckily you can easily fit a breaker bar. The track bar was completely frozen in there. It's the first time my impact gun couldn't even budge a nut. I'm leaving it in place for now, but luckily I'm doing something quite fun and we'll address this in an upcoming video, so stay tuned for that. Now, unbolt the spring retainer and unbolt the shock absorber. Lower the suspension down as far as it will go and you should be able to easily remove the spring. I found the rear springs to be a lot easier to install and remove than the front springs, probably because of the much lower spring rate in the rear. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any new bump stops for the rear suspension, so these old ones will have to do. Put the new upper control arm in. You might have to jack the axle up a little bit for it to line up. Thread the nuts onto the bolts, but don't tighten anything yet. Putting the new spring in should be also fairly easy. Make sure to line the spring up with the groove on the axle where the spring coil ends. Put the spring retainer back on while there's no load on the spring, otherwise it's hard to get the retainer in between the two bottom coils. Now it's time to fit the shock absorber. Again, you only want to thread the nuts on but not tighten them yet. I suggest you start by fitting the bottom of the shock first, and then line up the top by jacking the axle up. It's a lot easier to push the bottom into the bracket if you can wiggle the entire shock around. The final step is to tighten everything to the correct torque. The crucial step is to put the weight of the car onto the axle. You always want to tighten anything with rubber bushings with the suspension in its neutral position. The reason for this is the articulation of all the components is given by the twisting of the rubber in the bushing, so you want the bushing to be tightened in the resting state of the suspension. If you don't do this, the bushings will suffer an early failure. Imagine if you tightened everything with the axle fully drooped. Once the weight of the car is on the axle, all the bushings would twist, and they would stay twisted all the time, quickly tearing the bushing apart. That's why suspension components that are made out of rubber must always be tightened with the weight of the car on them. I will post all the torque specs in the description below for ease of reference. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you all again very soon.